This series started by looking at people who were labeled as too much, too loud, too emotional, and too different, and asking a different question. What if they weren't too much, but just misunderstood? And the response to this series has been incredibly strong and encouraging because people aren't just listening, they're recognizing patterns, and not just in history, but in their workplaces. So, as we expand this series, we're also shifting the lens a little from awareness to understanding what this actually looks like in practice. So, today we're looking at Hannah Gadsby. So, question: how much of what you're seeing in your workplace is actually performance, and how much of it is adaptation? So let's get into it. Hannah Gadsby built a career making people laugh, but what made them stand out is what they chose to stop doing rather than what they were doing. So Gadsby is an artistic comedian, a writer, and an actor. And for years, their work reflected something that shows up in almost every organization: masking. So, masking is the process of adjusting how you speak, how you behave, and how you present yourself to meet the expectations of the environment around you. And this doesn't just happen for neurodivergent people. This happens across the entire spectrum of minority workers. And I say minority because realistically, together, it's actually probably more of a majority. But I digress. So, what masking can look like in the workplace is scripting conversations in your head, studying how other people communicate, holding back your responses because you don't want people to think you're being difficult or um, obtuse or any of those things, right? And really, what it culminates in is presenting a more acceptable version of yourself. And this is where it becomes relevant for leaders and managers to understand, because masking is often what gets rewarded. So, what organizations describe as professionalism, culture fit, executive presence is often just a familiarity and a comfort with people who communicate in expected ways. So, did you know Gatsby's show Nanette deliberately breaks the structure of traditional commentary? It starts as a stand up, and then something shifts. The jokes stop, the structure changes entirely. And what you're left with is something much more direct. And because Gatsby explains how comedy works throughout, you right? And she kind of explains how it builds tension and then you release that tension with a punchline. But they ask a different question in Nana, and that's: what happens when the punchline cuts off the truth? What happens when complexity is reduced so that the audience stays comfortable? And this is exactly what is happening in workplaces all over the world. People learn very quickly what gets rewarded, what gets challenged, and what gets labeled as too much. And then they adjust accordingly, not because it's accurate, but because it's effective. And in Gatsby's earlier work, there was this pattern. They were the punchline. Stories about discomfort, about not fitting in, about being misunderstood. And audiences laughed because that's what the structure demanded of them. But over time, Gadsby really began to question that because every time those stories were told in that way, they were reduced. And while it made it easier to consume, it didn't sit comfortably. And in Nanette, Gadsby stopped doing that. They stopped filtering everything through what would make other people feel comfortable and started telling the truth in full. Not simplified, not softened, just complete. And this is where it becomes a leadership issue. In organizations, people are constantly editing themselves. They soften language, they hold back their observations, and they avoid saying what needs to be said because their directness is often misinterpreted and labeled as difficult or abrasive or challenging. But those labels aren't neutral, they're interpretations. And they're often based on expectation rather than accuracy. So, my question for leaders is not how do we manage this behavior, but rather what are we actually seeing? Is this a performance issue? Or is this somebody communicating in a way that doesn't match the dominant style of the room? Because those two things are not the same thing. And when they get treated as the same thing, you create risk. You lose people. People who spot issues early, that ask the necessary questions, that challenge flawed thinking and bring clarity into ambiguity. Amazingly, Gadsby did not stop communicating. They changed how they communicated. And that shift changed how their work was understood. And not because they changed, but the structure around them did. So, if you're leading a team or managing a workplace, the question is simple. How many people are you evaluating based on how comfortable their communication is rather than how valuable it is? Because when someone is described as difficult, it's worth asking. Not difficult, maybe direct. And when you look at Hannah Gadsby now, they weren't too much. They weren't too difficult. They were navigating an environment that prioritized comfort over clarity. The person didn't change, but their narrative did. And in turn, that narrative changed those structures around them. And as we talk through autism action and autism acceptance during the month of April, I think it's really, really important for us to understand that the voices of the people with these diagnoses and with these insights should be listened to. And it's important that in listening to those voices, we understand that they've been able to change their narrative and the narrative for other people, right? And that doesn't take like huge implementations of systems, of new thinking of all of those things. These are relatively easy changes. It's just that moment when we decide to change the narrative. And that's something that I really want to celebrate in Hannah's story. And if you don't know Hannah's comedy, please go check her out. We'll share some links in the comments and in the description. And yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts. We love getting your feedback. And we're excited for you to join us for our next snack chat. And yeah, send me some ideas of who you want us to talk about next. Look forward to it. Bye.